Good.
Welcome to another episode of AARP's periodic show on the mental well-being of older adults. This interview is being recorded, as were our other ones, our previous ones, and the recordings are available to everyone at youtube.com / AARP Maryland. My name is Phyllis Meyerson, and I'm a volunteer with AARP, heading up our Speakers Bureau and also participating with the advocacy team. So today's interview is on a very important topic, that of dealing with the emotional challenges caregivers face when they're taking on the task of caregiving. I'm happy to introduce Barry J. Jacobs, Doctor of Psychology, who is a Philadelphia-based clinical psychologist, a health consultant, and the co-author of AARP Meditations for Caregivers, as well as AARP Love and Meaning After 50. Dr. Jacobs writes a monthly column on family caregiving for the AARP website and is an honorary board member of the Well Spouse Association. So, welcome, Barry.
Thank you, Phil. It's great to be here.
Good, thank you. To get started, Barry, could you tell us how family caregiving is defined and what caregivers typically do?
Certainly, because there's a lot of confusion about the term family caregiver. It's a term that's been around about 30 years. Originally, people thought of it as a blood relation caring for a loved one. Typically, it could be an older adult, a parent, or it could be a spouse with a disability. But it would be a blood relation caring for that person. But really, in recent years, it's that definition is expanded, and it really is any close person. Sometimes family is not a matter of blood; it's a matter of choice. It could be a neighbor, it could be a friend, but it's someone who's made the commitment to care for someone else who needs care. And family caregivers do a whole range of things, from very simple things to driving people to the doctor's office and picking up groceries and maybe picking up some of their medications from the pharmacy, to one end of the spectrum to at the other end of the spectrum, taking care of them, helping shower them, getting them dressed, doing what we call activities of daily living, a lot of very rigorous hands-on work. And all these folks come under the rubric of family caregiving. And there are folks who will start at one end. I did this for myself, caring for my mom. I first got involved in helping take care of her checkbook because her thinking skills were beginning to deteriorate, and she needed my help with that. But over time, began to take over more and more, making her meals, helping her with some of her activities of daily living eventually. And that's not an unusual course for a lot of caregivers. You start doing a little, and over time it grows to be much more.
Okay, you mentioned caregivers. I wonder if you could say something about the team that we usually end up with, whether we start with that or not. We usually end up with a team out of necessity. Could you talk a bit about that?
Certainly. So actually, most caregivers wind up doing this on their own. And it's the lucky caregiver that has a team of people working for them. And it's very important, I think, to have a team if you can, because then you're not so isolated, and the entire onus of care is not on your shoulders. But essentially, this idea of forming a caregiving team is asking other family members, maybe asking other people within the community, really looking first to family, then to then to friends and neighbors, and then finally to professionals. It could be a home health aide as part of the caregiving team. Could be a physical therapist as part of the caregiving team. But it becomes this group of people, all of whom are working in close conjunction, to provide care, to enable the person who needs care to live as well as they can. And sometimes caregiving teams are very organized. They'll have regular meetings, almost like board meetings, where they make decisions together, they coordinate care. Other times it's a kind of loose confederation of people that may not communicate very well together. It's better when there's a large caregiving team and where there's, as with any large group, where there's a leader who's helping coordinate activities among the different members of that team.
That's interesting because there's a family member that I have to. I'm part of the team, but it was only yesterday. And I've been doing this for a while now, but it was only yesterday, maybe the day before, that I realized that all of us who I go out on Monday, somebody else goes out on Tuesday, somebody else comes out on Friday, and I realized that's our team. And it took me a little bit of time to perceive it as a team activity. Okay, another question. How are family caregivers affected by caring for loved ones? What emotions do they usually experience or struggle with? And why do they often feel so guilty?
Okay, and we'll start with how they're affected. Uh, we could spend probably an entire hour or more talking about guilt alone, but so there's been quite a lot of research that's been done over the years about how caregivers are affected by caregiving, and it basically finds that most people are stressed. There is a smaller percentage, maybe about a third of caregivers that are highly stressed, and the ones that are highly stressed are more prone to negative both psychological consequences, for instance, depression or anxiety, and medical consequences, developing their own health problems. But for most of us, caring for someone is an important task that we take on. We often do it because we feel a sense of purpose in doing it, maybe a sense of fulfilling a duty. But it's often, it can be very gratifying for many folks, especially if you feel like you're making a significant difference. But there's often a lot of sadness that goes along with it, seeing someone you care about declining, seeing them helpless sometimes, feeling that their suffering is causing you to suffer. There can be a lot of anger at maybe lack of cooperation on the part of the person you're caring for, or lack of cooperation among other family members, or even anger at the healthcare professionals who don't seem to be helping provide as much assistance as you would like. Where the guilt comes in, and the guilt unfortunately is extremely common, is that people feel like caregivers feel like they should help their loved one get better, live better, and when their efforts fall short, oftentimes just because of the reality of the situation, somehow they take it, they feel responsible for it. Somehow that if they were worked harder, if they were more devoted, that they can somehow turn things around. I've heard many people, for instance, say this to me about dementia. If I'm a good enough caregiver, I could help this person get rid of their dementia. When unfortunately we know that from a scientific standpoint, that's not true. The dementia, if it really is dementia, is going to progress regardless of how perfect a caregiver may be. And the fact is, most caregivers are not perfect because most human beings are not perfect. So, but caregivers, like many of us, are very apt to focus on the things that they don't do well. Maybe they got irritated one time and raised their voice, or maybe they forgot to pick up some medications one time, or maybe they overslept and didn't show up for an appointment. Those things unfortunately loom large in their minds. They may do 99 things really well for their loved one, but that one thing that they may have made a mistake about, they tend to beat themselves up about. And that's where the guilt comes in. So a lot of the work that I do for caregivers in my work as a psychologist is I'm trying to lower this standard of perfection, help people see themselves as really doing extremely good work just by dint of being devoted and loving family members, even if that means they're imperfect at times. No one is expecting perfection. No one needs a perfect caregiver. They need a good enough caregiver.
How do you do that in general? I think that's kind of an interesting concept, but how do you deal with that? Because there's those kinds of things, anger and guilt are so difficult to get rid of. What do you do in the
So,
service?
one of the things I do is, let's say it's a husband and wife, and the wife is caring for the husband. And sometimes the husband is, stubborn, doesn't want to eat, doesn't want to take a shower, doesn't want to do a lot of things, and the wife, who's a caregiver, gets irritated and maybe even expresses some of that irritation, and then she feels terribly guilty for having maybe spoken harshly to her husband. What I often say to her is, before your husband began to develop illness, did the two of you ever have any arguments? Did you ever have any kind of friction at all? And she would say, well, of course. And I say, well, I mean, why would this be any different now? It's just part of the relationship between two human beings that live in close proximity. There's just a little bit of a friction, that occurs when people are rubbing elbows all the time. And that means that for folks to feel like once their loved one has an illness or disability, that somehow they can't be spoken to in the way that they've always been spoken to is not realistic. I mean, we're human beings. We're going to react to things that go on. Sometimes the people we're caring for are in fact irritating, and we're going to get irritable about them. And so I try to help people see these reactions that they're not proud of in terms of normalcy. This is what most caregivers experience. And if they go through it, it doesn't mean that they're somehow committing some heinous crime.
I was to support that, I was at a caregivers cafe at Johns Hopkins Hospital many, many years ago, I guess it was. And the thing that all the participants agreed upon was that no matter how hard they tried, at the end of the day, the caregivers felt that they hadn't done enough for their loved ones. And I think that's what you're saying. Yeah.
I think so. And that's unfortunate, because caregivers work awfully hard. And really what I try to do is to help them see the positive difference that they're making. Can they save their loved one from illness and disability? The answer is no. And to expect themselves to do that is unfortunate, because it means that they're setting themselves up to not be able to reach this high bar and then to feel like a failure. And instead, I help them see what a difference they're making in the quality of their loved one's life, and that's all I think any of us can do for the people we care about.
Okay. We know that there are multiple roles that the caregivers play. I'm reminded of a Pew Research study. They said the average family caregiver, is a 49-year-old woman who works 30 hours a week and provides almost 25 hours of care for her loved one. And of course, most of these caregivers are women, so they have children to take care of and so forth. Given this data, how can caregivers balance their multiple family roles, their work lives, their caretaking roles, and still have time for themselves?
You make it sound like such an easy question, Phyllis, and it's not an easy question.
Because I'm asking it, you have the hard part of answering it.
It's extremely hard, obviously. And really what I try to do with folks that are in this position who feel, and I have to say, I was in this position when I was caring for my mom. My mom had vascular dementia. My stepfather had Alzheimer's disease at the same time. I was helping care for both of them. I was working full time. I had 2 teenage children. I had a wife that, it'd be nice if we got to see one another every now and then. And what happened is that I felt that I was spreading myself so thin that I wasn't a good son to my mom. I wasn't a good son to my stepson, to my stepfather, or I wasn't a good husband, father, worker, you name it. I felt like I was not doing a good job at anything. And what it really required of me, and I think requires of caregivers in general, is stepping back and sometimes just assessing what they're capable of doing in a 24-hour period, and what the limitations they have, because all of us have limitations, and then to make a more realistic caregiving plan in accordance with the limitations that we have. And that may mean, for instance, that we cut down the number of hours for which we provide care to a parent. By bringing other family members in, by bringing paid help in if we could afford it, because what I found in my case is that the amount of time I spent with my mom came at the expense of my wife. That was only going to fly, but for so long. My wife is extremely supportive, but our relationship suffered because of the time I devoted to my mom. The same thing happened with my children. When I realized that I maybe I needed to rethink the balance, then I had to step back and make different choices. And did those choices make me feel guilty? Sure they did. but I also felt guilty when I was spread thin and doing no good for anybody. So sometimes it requires having a conversation with someone else, an outside party, who can help you think about how do you divvy up your time, and even more importantly, how do you bring in more people, more energy into the caregiving system, so that it's not all on your shoulders.
And that's a great example. Thank you. Because when we started this section, I said the women are the main caregivers. And no, they're not. What you very aptly described is that, yeah, the men are out there too during their share. So
Yes,
that's a
yeah,
good way to look at it. Thank you.
yeah. The breakdown is actually 60% of all caregivers are women, 40% are men. 20 years ago, it was 70-30. So us men are stepping up and doing more. And I, if I had sisters, maybe they would have wound up caring for my mom. But my mom had no daughters; she only had sons. Me and my brother doing the work.
Okay. Okay. One of the things you've alluded to, but we haven't really talked about, is burnout. And are certain caregivers more likely to feel burnout? And if so, why? And how can burnout be prevented or overcome?
So let's define burnout first. So burnout is when people are both physically and emotionally depleted. They've been running on empty for a long time because they push themselves so hard, and they wake up every day with a sense of dread that, oh my Lord, I've got to do this again, and they really have a hard time kind of mustering the energy to do the things that they need to do, and they're dragging. And folks who get really burnt out are prone to getting clinically depressed. So you asked the question, are some caregivers more prone to burnout than others? And the answer is yes. So caregivers that are working, doing caregiving more than 25 hours a week, so just the amount of caregiving people are doing comes into play with burnout. I think caregiving for someone who has dementia is probably the hardest kind of caregiving there is. Those folks are prone to burnout. And I think that folks that are reluctant to accepting help, which unfortunately happens, there are many caregivers that feel like they're responsible for doing it themselves, and they will not allow other people to step in, even other family members to step in and help. And consequently, they wear themselves down, and they're more likely to burn out. And the way to prevent burnout is really to increase the size of the caregiving team, as we talked about before, and to really revise a caregiving plan so it's not so arduous, so it's more sustainable. What I always talk about with caregivers is that caregiving, particularly for someone who has a long-lasting disease like dementia, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And that's a cliche, I know, but it's a very effective cliche. So to run a marathon, people have to know how to sustain themselves over the course of the race. Otherwise, they're going to burn out in the middle of the race and have to drop out. And to run a marathon, people have to take in nutrients. They've got to know the lay of the land, i.e., know a little bit about what the trajectory of dementia is going to be. And they need to know something about how do I run alongside others? How do I get support so that I feel like we're all doing this together? So those are the ways caregivers avoid burnout, so that they can get from the beginning of the caregiving to the end without having to stop. Because that's not what people want. People don't go into caregiving saying, well, I'll do it for a little while and I'm going to stop. People go into it saying, I'm going to do this for as long as my loved one does this, but they have to be smart and strategic about it to prevent burnout.
You said something about caregivers rejecting help when it's offered to them. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, Phyllis, unfortunately in my work, I have seen a lot of this over the years. And these are often folks that may be more guilt prone, feel like accepting help is tantamount to shirking their duties, and that would make them feel guilty. So they don't want, other family members offer help, and they say, no, I'm fine, I've got it. Their own primary care doctor or other people might say to them, you really need to take it easy. And they say, no, I'm fine. And they take this on themselves and feel like they have to do this. Otherwise, if they deviate from the course that they set for themselves at all, that they are failing. And so to prevent that sense of failure, they are very resistant to accepting help. The unfortunate paradox here is by resisting accepting help, they make themselves more likely to burn out and less likely to fulfill the mission that they've set for themselves. And so the conversation I always have with caregivers is your sense of mission, the sense of purpose that's very important for you is to provide care to your loved one for as long as your loved one needs it. To do that, you really need to accept help to enable you to do that. Otherwise, you're going to put yourself in a position where you're going to be unable to fulfill this very important goal that you set. And I say to them, I want you to achieve this goal because it's an important goal. But to do that, we have to kind of think about what other resources we bring in.
Oh, okay. Do you ever get into the family dynamics when you get into that? The brother doesn't want the sister to do it, the sister doesn't want the aunt to do it.
Every day of the week, 12, all day long, family dynamics. I mean, because, there's the, we're talking a lot about how caregivers feel, internally, but there's a relationship between the caregiver and the care receiver. It could be good, it could be bad, it could be very, very complicated. There's a relationship that the caregiver has, say, with their siblings, with other family members, which could be good, could be bad. Everything, all these relationships have histories. Those histories all have an impact on how the caregiving decisions are made, how the caregiving team works together, and so the dynamics comes into play. In the best case situation, family caregiving brings family members closer together. In the worst case situation, family caregiving causes schisms in families, and family members are less close at the end of the day.
Yeah. Okay, there's one other question that kind of came up to me, which I kind of saved for the end because I think it's probably one of the most difficult ones. How can family caregivers resume their normal activities when the loved ones they've been caring for die? That's a toughie, I think.
It is a toughie, and when I work with caregivers, what I typically do is I work with them as they're caregiving to the end of the caregiving, and then oftentimes work sometimes for as long as 6 months to a year afterwards to help them adjust to non-caregiving life. So the folks that do this well often are able to take to come away from caregiving with a pat on the back, sense of pride, sense of having done the right thing. They have sadness about the person that they've lost. Sometimes they have a real sense of loss about the caregiving role. It becomes a very meaningful role for many folks. It becomes their sense of identity. But what I help people reflect on is how meaningful this experience has been for them, and how they've grown as a result of this experience. They may have grown by learning new skills. They may have grown by becoming more mature, and that those new skills and that maturity can be applied in other life roles, and they can bring it to bear on other family situations. I have seen caregivers go from one caregiving situation to another within a family. They become what I call serial caregivers. A caregiver, caregiver one person after another. I have seen people go into, they finish caregiving and they volunteer at a hospital, for instance, so that they continue to be in a caring, compassionate role. And then I've seen others who basically said, I've done this. I don't want to have this experience again. I want to go back to the things that really meant a lot to me before that I have had to set aside while I was caregiving. So there's no one right way to do this, but I think people need to kind of think it through and think about just how they've been changed by this experience and what new energy, what new wisdom they can bring to their lives as a result of this. And I think oftentimes people feel like they can bring a lot more to their other relationships, to their other roles, and that this has a very positive impact on who they are and how they're going to help others as they go forward.
What happens to that, the guilt and the frustration we're talking about when the person dies? How do they deal with that?
Sometimes they deal with it with a lot of difficulty, unfortunately. When people feel guilty because they feel like they didn't do enough, or they They dwell on that one time when they yelled at their loved one. That guilt tends to haunt them, and sometimes makes the grief process more complicated. Um, and I end up working with caregivers around that to help them see again that truly in the time that they did the best that they could with the limitations that they had. Were they perfect? They were not. Should they have expected themselves to be perfect? No. Can they forgive themselves for any mistakes that they made? My hope is yes, because they we you know they devoted themselves to providing care for a loved one. They made sacrifices of their own time and energy to care for a loved one. There's something highly commendable in that in and of itself, and their performance in that role is usually far better than they themselves rate. And so I try to help people kind of lessen the guilt and come away from this caregiving experience with a sense of having made a positive difference. Was it perfect? It was not imperfect, but they did pretty darn well.
Okay. You talk about you having people come in and ask for your help. When is it obvious that the caregiver needs support? It may be your support or the public support, whatever. But when does that become pretty noticeable?
Well, so let me answer that question this way, Phyllis. I think all caregivers need support from the beginning, right? I think, like if we're going to use that marathon metaphor, nobody runs a marathon and they go past the first water station in mile 3 and says, "No, thank you. I don't need water now. I don't need support. I'll keep going until I need support. I won't drink any water until I'm thirsty." Nobody does that because it's not a way to sustain yourself. The way caregivers sustain themselves is they use any and all support right from the beginning. If someone offers to help them, or the other family members want to share the caregiving with them, they don't say no. I'll let you know later when I need it. It's not a good idea, because then what happens oftentimes is people will burn out, and then they're asking for help, and then it's very difficult to put some water back in the well when they've completely depleted themselves. So my answer to that is they need support from the get-go, and they should accept any and all help that's offered to them without any shame, without feeling that somehow it means that they're not a good enough relative.
Okay, thank you for that answer. We're kind of at the end, or so kind of at the end, and I can't get rid of this thing on my. I'm trying to get in. Oh, there we go. Okay. Let's look at some of the questions that have come up in the
Sure.
comment section. Hank is asking, if a caregiver thinks that someone has dementia but is not diagnosed, what are your recommendations on how to handle that?
So my recommendation would be to start with a person's primary care provider. And what I would do is reach out to the provider without your loved one being present. I would either call that provider, or I would put it in writing and send a letter to them and saying, I have the concerns that my loved one's thinking skills are declining. Please do an assessment, a screening of their thinking skills to see whether they have that they're beginning to develop dementia. And so most primary care providers can do either what's called the mini mental status exam, or the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, better known as the MOCA. They're very short, takes 8-9 minutes to administer. It gives you a very rough screening score. And on the basis of that, if the primary care provider is concerned that someone's developing dementia, the next step will be to refer that loved one to a specialist, like a neurologist. But I would start with primary care. I would not wait till the dementia gets worse before bringing it to the attention of the primary care provider, because what medications we have available currently to help with dementia work best in the early stages. We want to use medicines like Aricept as early as possible to get the greatest benefit. And those medicines, by the way, don't cure dementia, but they slow down the progression of dementia.
Okay. You said that the primary care would be the person to go to. what guidance do you have for people who are doing that? Because they need to be able to evaluate what the primary care is doing, whether it's a full evaluation, or what do they need to look for when they walk into the primary care's office?
So, I mean, most primary care providers are trained to do these screening tests that I just mentioned to you, the MOCA and the mini mental status exam. They're very gross screens. They're not going to make a diagnosis of dementia on the basis of those screens, but they're going to basically kind of say, yes, we need more evaluation, or no more evaluation is needed. And on the basis, so primary care providers will kind of tell you, yes, I think you should go on to the neurologist for a more in-depth screen. And so that I think is a pretty important role, just to kind of help people get directed in the right way.
Okay, thank you. It looks like our time is just about up. It's wonderful to be hearing all this advice, and we certainly do thank you, Barry, for taking your time and giving us your expertise on it. The thing that we want to kind of leave you with is that those who are going through caretaking or anticipating it in the near future should know that they're not alone. And the figures that I have is over 5 million adults in the United States are caregivers. And it used to be the 49-year-old women. I think that's probably too old now. We've got people who are 24 to 28 who are sending.
Actually, the average caregiver is 49, and there are about 53 million people who provide care. And yes, it's still mostly a lot of folks who are in that kind of middle age range that have other family responsibilities.
Okay, thank you. Let's put that slide up that says the resources again, please. Okay. Here are some of the caregiving resources. Of course, we start out with Dr. Jacobs, his books and recent articles. And we have supporting family caregivers in your state. You can read what we've got up there. Maryland Access Point is a wonderful place to start, and they will do a lot of referring you to various resources. The AARP caregiving resources, that's aarp.org /caregiving. And that's that's just a gathering all the information together and letting you decide what it is that's going to be helpful for you. And the Mental Health Association of Maryland, yes. Okay. I think that's probably, let me throw in a couple that we didn't have there. There is a mental health and aging website for Marylanders at www.md for Maryland aging. The trick here is that aging is spelled AGING. They've left the E out on purpose. At www.mdaging.org. And of course, AARP has numerous resources to help the caregivers with the practical elements and with the emotional challenge. We have a booklet out that AARP has published called Prepare to Care Guide. And it's a wonderful booklet to go through all the steps, first of all, in recognizing, then getting treatment, and then moving on to how to take care of the caregiver. So, Barry, do you have any other comments you want to make? Any other thing that we left out?
I just want to say, for all of you who are providing care to someone, be good to yourselves. I mean, you're doing important work. You're really demonstrating the value and the meaning of family. And I wish you luck with this work. And I would just second that. Run that marathons in a smart and a strategic way. Use what support is available. And I'll just thank you, Phyllis, and thank AARP of Maryland for this opportunity. Glad you're putting out this message, because I think it's such an important one.
Thank you. And we certainly appreciate your coming here and sharing your experiences with us. Thank you so much. Well, we hope the listeners have found this to be useful. And again, thank you very much, Barry. Okay, up here.